The dust rose in thick plumes around the wooden platform, where three young women stood, shackled together, their faces streaked with grime and tears, and the crowd of men below them shouted numbers like they were bidding on livestock instead of human souls. Rebecca Zimmerman felt her youngest sister's hand trembling in hers as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the plaza in Cheyenne, Wyoming. It was June 1883, and the blazing sun beat down mercilessly on the three sisters who had been dragged to this hellish place after their parents' wagon had been attacked 3 weeks prior. Rebecca was 22, her middle sister Ruth was 20, and the youngest Rose had just turned 18 2 months before their world had collapsed into this nightmare. "Do I hear 500 for the lot?" the auctioneer bellowed, his jowls shaking as he gestured toward them with his cane. Three healthy young women, all educated, can read and write, perfect for housework or whatever else you might need. The crowd erupted in raucous laughter that made Rebecca's stomach turn. She squeezed both her sister's hands tighter, trying to be strong even though fear coursed through every fiber of her being. Ruth stood rigid beside her, her jaw clenched so hard Rebecca could see the muscles working beneath her skin. Rose was openly crying now, her shoulders shaking with each sob. 600, a portly man in a stained vest called out, leering up at them with yellow teeth. 700, another voice countered from somewhere in the back. Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to pray, but the words would not come. How had their lives come to this? Their father had been a school teacher in Pennsylvania, their mother a seamstress. They had been traveling west to start a new life in California when the bandits had struck on the trail outside of Cheyenne. Their parents had fought to protect them, and both had died in the dirt, while Rebecca and her sisters had been bound and gagged and thrown into a wagon. The men who took them had brought them here, to this auction, claiming the sisters owed a debt for room and board during the time they had been held captive. It was all lies, all corruption, but there was no law that cared about three orphaned women with no money and no connections. 800, the portly man shouted, more insistent now. "Do I hear 9? The auctioneer asked, scanning the crowd with eager eyes. The silence stretched for a moment, and Rebecca felt her heart plummeting. If that awful man in the stained vest bought them, she knew exactly what kind of fate awaited her and her sisters. She had heard the other girls in the holding pen whispering about the brothels and the mining camps where women disappeared and were never heard from again. $3,000. The voice cut through the plaza like a knife, deep and firm, and brooking no argument. The entire crowd turned to look at the speaker, and Rebecca's eyes flew open. She followed their gazes to see a tall man stepping through the throng, his wide-brimmed hat casting shadows across a face that was all hard angles and weathered bronze skin. He wore typical cowboy attire, dusty leather chaps over worn denim, a dark vest over a cotton shirt, and a gun belt slung low on his hips. But there was something different about him, something in the way he carried himself that commanded attention. 3,000 for all three, the cowboy repeated, his voice steady as he approached the platform. Cash money. The auctioneer's eyes bulged nearly out of his head. "Did you say 3,000, mister?" "I did." The cowboy reached into his vest and pulled out a thick wad of bills. "Count it if you want. $3,000 for the three sisters, and I want the sale finalized right now with proper paperwork stating I'm their legal guardian." Rebecca's mind reeled. $3,000 was an enormous sum, more than most men made in several years of hard labor. Who was this man, and why would he pay so much for them? A new kind of fear bloomed in her chest, because someone who would spend that much money surely expected a significant return on his investment. The auctioneer was already scrambling down from the platform, his greedy fingers reaching for the money. Yes, of course, Mr. Kellen, the cowboy said. Thomas Kellen. The transaction happened with stunning speed. Papers were signed, money changed hands, and within 10 minutes, Thomas Kellen was climbing up onto the platform while the auctioneer unlocked the shackles that bound the three sisters together. Rebecca's wrists ached as the metal fell away, and she immediately wrapped her arms around Rose, who was still crying. Thomas Kellen stood before them, and up close, Rebecca could see he was probably in his late 20s, with eyes the color of storm clouds and a scar running through his left eyebrow. He looked at each of them in turn, his expression unreadable, and then he did something that shocked Rebecca to her core. He took off his hat and held it respectfully in his hands. "You're free now," he said quietly. His words meant only for them and not for the dispersing crowd below. "I bought you to give you your freedom, not to own you. You're free to go wherever you want, do whatever you want. I'll give you money for train tickets, for a fresh start, for whatever you need." Rebecca stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. "What?" "You heard me right, madam," Thomas said, and there was something almost gentle in his rough voice. "Nobody should be bought and sold like property. I had the money, so I used it. You don't owe me anything." Ruth had stopped trembling and was now looking at Thomas with open suspicion. "Why would you do that? Nobody gives away $3,000 for nothing." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "I have my reasons, and they're my own. But I promise you, I expect nothing from you three except that you take this chance and make something good of your lives." Rose lifted her tear-stained face from Rebecca's shoulder. "Are you real?" she whispered. "Or are we dead, and this is heaven?" A ghost of a smile flickered across Thomas's face. "You're very much alive, little miss, and if you three will follow me, I'll take you somewhere safe where you can clean up, get some food, and figure out your next steps." Rebecca's instincts warred within her. Everything about this situation screamed danger, warned her that no man did something like this without ulterior motives. But when she looked into Thomas Kellen's eyes, she saw something there that gave her pause. It was pain, old and deep, the kind that came from loss and regret. This man had suffered, and somehow that suffering had made him into someone who would spend a fortune to save three strangers. "We'll come with you," Rebecca heard herself say. Ruth shot her a sharp look, but Rebecca gave a tiny shake of her head. "We don't have anywhere else to go, and I don't think we have much choice but to trust you, Mr. Kellen." "Just Thomas," he said, settling his hat back on his head. "And for what it's worth, you can trust me. I give you my word." Thomas led them through the streets of Cheyenne, past saloons and general stores, and the railroad station, where steam engines hissed and clanged. People stared at the strange quartet, the tall cowboy and the three bedraggled women following in his wake. But Thomas ignored the looks and kept walking until they reached a small but well-maintained boarding house on the edge of town. The proprietress was a plump woman in her 50s named Mrs. Henderson, who took one look at the sisters and immediately began fussing over them. "Oh, you poor dears," she clucked, ushering them inside. "Thomas, you bring them right upstairs. I have 3 rooms available, and I'll have baths drawn immediately." "Much obliged, Mrs. Henderson," Thomas said. He turned to the sisters. "Get yourselves cleaned up and rested. I'll be back this evening with some supper and new clothes for you all. Mrs. Henderson will make sure you have everything you need in the meantime." Before Rebecca could respond, Thomas tipped his hat and walked back out the door, leaving the 3 sisters standing in the boarding house parlor, shell-shocked and overwhelmed. The next few hours passed in a blur of hot water, soap, and clean towels. Rebecca soaked in the copper tub until her skin pruned, scrubbing away weeks of grime and fear. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a borrowed robe, she felt more human than she had since the attack on their wagon. "Mrs. Henderson had laid out simple cotton dresses for each of them, not new but clean and well-mended, and Rebecca dressed slowly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. When she made her way downstairs, she found Ruth and Rose already in the parlor, sitting close together on the settee. They looked transformed, their hair washed and braided, their faces clean and young again. Rose had stopped crying, though her eyes were still red and puffy. Ruth's expression remained guarded, suspicious. "He's coming back with supper," Mrs. Henderson announced cheerfully, bustling in with a tea service. "Such a good man, that Thomas Kellen. Known him for 5 years now, ever since he came to Cheyenne. Never speaks much about his past, but he's got a good heart underneath all that gruffness." Rebecca accepted a cup of tea gratefully. "Do you know why he would do something like this? Spend so much money to help people he doesn't know?" Mrs. Henderson's expression grew somber. "That's his story to tell, not mine. But I will say this, he understands suffering, that one does. And he's tried to make up for past regrets by doing good where he can." Before Rebecca could ask more questions, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Henderson opened it to reveal Thomas standing on the porch, his arms laden with packages. He had cleaned up as well, Rebecca noticed. His face was freshly shaved, his hair still damp and combed back, and he wore a clean shirt under his vest. "Evening, ladies," he said, carrying the packages inside. "I brought some clothes I hope will fit, and the restaurant down the street sent over supper. Roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie." The smell of the food made Rebecca's stomach clench with hunger. She could not remember the last time she had eaten a proper meal. The bandits who had held them captive had given them nothing but stale bread and water. They gathered around Mrs. Henderson's dining table, and for a while there was no sound but the clink of silverware and grateful eating. The food was simple but delicious, and Rebecca ate until she thought she might burst. Across the table, Rose was devouring her pie with the enthusiasm of youth, while Ruth ate more slowly, her eyes never leaving Thomas. Finally, when the meal was finished and Mrs. Henderson had cleared the dishes, Thomas leaned back in his chair and looked at the three sisters. "I expect you have questions," he said. "Many," Ruth replied bluntly, "starting with who you really are and why you did what you did today." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the table. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough. "I grew up in Texas, on a ranch outside of Austin. Had a wife and a baby daughter. Sweetest little girl you ever saw, with curls like spun gold and a laugh that could light up the whole world." Rebecca's heart clenched at the past tense. "There was a drought," Thomas continued, staring at something only he could see. "Ranch was failing, and I was desperate. A man came through town offering good money for workers to help transport cargo across the territory. I needed the money, so I signed on without asking too many questions." He paused, his jaw working. "Turned out the cargo was people, captives from raided settlements, mostly women and children, being taken to be sold." The room had gone deathly silent. "By the time I realized what was happening, we were 2 days out," Thomas said. "I confronted the leader, tried to free the captives, got beaten within an inch of my life for my trouble, and left for dead in the desert. Took me a week to make it back to town, and by the time I did," his voice cracked. "By the time I did, my wife had died of fever. My baby daughter had been taken by my wife's sister, who blamed me for leaving them destitute. She moved back east, and I never saw my little girl again." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. Beside her, even Ruth's hard expression had softened. "That was 6 years ago," Thomas said. "I've spent every day since trying to make it right. I work as a foreman for a big cattle operation, make good money, and I use it to help people when I can. When I heard about the auction today, I knew I had to be there. I couldn't save those people 6 years ago, and I couldn't save my own family, but I could save you 3. Rose got up from her chair and walked around the table. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around Thomas's shoulders and hugged him. Thomas stiffened in surprise, then slowly, carefully patted her arm. "Thank you?" Rose whispered. "Thank you for saving us." Rebecca wiped her eyes. "What you did today, it was the bravest, most selfless thing I've ever witnessed. We're strangers to you, and yet you gave us our lives back." Thomas gently disentangled himself from Rose's embrace and stood, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion in the room. "You don't need to thank me. I just need to know you'll be all right. Do you have family somewhere? Somewhere you can go?" Rebecca exchanged glances with her sisters. "We have an aunt in California," she said slowly. "Our mother's sister. We were traveling to live with her when we were attacked, but we have no money for train tickets and no way to contact her to let her know what happened." "I'll take care of the tickets," Thomas said immediately, "and we can send a telegram in the morning. When do you want to leave?" Ruth spoke up for the first time in a while. "What if we don't want to leave right away?" Everyone looked at her in surprise. "I mean," Ruth continued, her cheeks flushing slightly, "we've been through something terrible. Maybe we need some time to recover before we travel across half the country. And besides, Thomas spent a fortune on us. The least we can do is stay long enough to thank him properly." Rebecca studied her sister curiously. Ruth was not usually the sentimental type, but there was something in her eyes that suggested her reasons for wanting to stay were not entirely altruistic. Thomas looked uncertain. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need. I'll cover your room and board here at Mrs. Henderson's until you're ready to travel. But I don't want you to feel obligated to me. You don't owe me anything." "Maybe we want to stay," Rose said softly. "Maybe we want to get to know the man who saved our lives." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm not a good man," he said quietly. "I've made terrible mistakes. I'm just trying to do better, that's all." Rebecca stood and walked over to him. She was tall for a woman, but Thomas still had several inches on her. She looked up into his storm-gray eyes and saw the pain and guilt that lived there. "You're a better man than you think," she said firmly. "And if my sisters and I want to stay in Cheyenne for a while, I think that's our choice to make." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes, something that made Rebecca's heart skip unexpectedly. "If that's what you want," he said, "then I'll help you get settled. I can probably find work for you in town if you need it, help you earn your own money." "I can sew," Rebecca offered. "My mother taught me. Ruth is good with numbers. She could do bookkeeping. And Rose has a beautiful singing voice." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'll ask around. Cheyenne's a growing town, lots of opportunities for people willing to work hard." Over the following weeks, the sisters settled into life in Cheyenne. True to his word, Thomas helped them find employment. Rebecca was hired by the town's only dressmaker, a stern but fair woman named Miss Paulson, who needed help keeping up with orders. Ruth found work keeping books for the general store owner, a widower named Mr. Patterson, who was grateful for her neat handwriting and head for figures. Rose, the youngest and most outgoing of the three, got a job serving tables at the town's respectable restaurant and occasionally singing for the dinner guests. Thomas visited them regularly, always respectful, always proper. He would take them on walks around town, showing them the sights, introducing them to the decent folks, and warning them away from the rougher elements. He never overstayed his welcome, never made them uncomfortable, but Rebecca found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that both thrilled and frightened her. She was drawn to him in ways she did not fully understand. Thomas Kellen was not a classically handsome man. His face was too weathered, too marked by hardship. But there was a strength in him, a quiet integrity that called to something deep inside her. When he looked at her with those gray eyes, she felt seen in a way she never had before. One evening in early July, about a month after the auction, Thomas took Rebecca for a walk along the creek that ran through the edge of town. The summer air was warm and pleasant, carrying the scent of wildflowers and prairie grass. They walked in comfortable silence for a while before Rebecca finally found the courage to speak what was on her mind. "Thomas, can I ask you something personal?" He glanced at her, then nodded. "Go ahead." "Do you ever think about trying to find your daughter? Your wife's sister took her east, but surely there's a way to track them down." Thomas's expression closed off, becoming carefully neutral. "I think about her every day," he admitted, "but her aunt made it clear she didn't want me in the child's life, said I was a failure and a disgrace, that I had let her sister die, and maybe she was right." "She wasn't right," Rebecca said fiercely. "You made a mistake, yes, but you were trying to provide for your family, and you've spent 6 years trying to atone for it. That takes real character, Thomas." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Why do you care so much, Rebecca? You barely know me." Rebecca felt her cheeks warming, but refused to look away. "I know enough," she said quietly. "I know you're a good man who's been carrying guilt that's not entirely yours to bear. I know you saved me and my sisters when you had every reason to just walk away. I know that when I'm with you, I feel safe for the first time since my parents died." Something in Thomas's expression cracked, and for a moment, Rebecca saw raw emotion beneath his carefully controlled exterior. "Rebecca," he said, his voice rough, "I'm 14 years older than you. I'm a broken man with a past I can't escape. You should be looking to build a future with someone whole, someone who can give you the life you deserve." "I'm 22 years old, Thomas, not a child," Rebecca replied, surprised by her own boldness. "I know my own mind. And I know that when I look at you, I see someone worth knowing, someone worth caring about." Thomas reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were calloused and warm against her skin. "You scare me," he admitted, "because when I'm with you, I start thinking about things I thought I'd lost the right to want. Things like a future, like happiness." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. "What if you haven't lost the right? What if you just have to let yourself be forgiven?" Before Thomas could respond, a shout echoed from back toward town. They both turned to see a man running toward them, waving his arms frantically. As he got closer, Rebecca recognized him as Deputy Morrison, one of the local lawmen Thomas had introduced her to. "Thomas!" the deputy called out, panting as he reached them. "Thank God I found you. There's trouble at the railroad station. Some men are trying to force a group of Chinese workers onto a train against their will, claiming they owe labor debts. It's about to turn into a riot." Thomas's expression hardened instantly. "How many men?" "6, maybe 7. They're armed." Thomas looked at Rebecca, conflict clear in his eyes. "I need to go help. Will you be all right getting back to the boarding house?" Rebecca squared her shoulders. "I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," Thomas said firmly. "It's too dangerous." I can help, Rebecca insisted. I can talk to the workers, make sure they know someone is on their side. Sometimes that makes all the difference. Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but Deputy Morrison interrupted. We need to hurry, Thomas. The station master is trying to hold them off, but he won't be able to for long. With a curse, Thomas nodded sharply. Fine, but you stay behind me and you do exactly what I say. Understood? Rebecca agreed, and they hurried back toward town, the deputy leading the way. By the time they reached the railroad station, a crowd had gathered. 6 rough-looking men with guns stood on the platform, surrounding about a dozen Chinese workers who were backed against a freight car, their faces etched with fear. The station master, an elderly man named Mr. Green, stood between the workers and the armed men, his hands raised placatingly. Thomas pushed through the crowd with Rebecca close behind him. His hand rested on the gun at his hip, and his voice rang out clear and commanding. That's enough. Let those men go. The leader of the armed group, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, turned to glare at Thomas. This doesn't concern you, Kellen. These workers owe debts to the railroad company. We're just collecting what's owed. By forcing them onto trains at gunpoint, Thomas replied coolly. That's called kidnapping, Hayes, and it's illegal. Hayes spat on the platform. The law doesn't care about Chinese workers. Everyone knows that. I care, Thomas said, and so does the deputy here. So why don't you and your men put down your weapons and let these people go before this gets ugly? Hayes laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You're outnumbered, Kellen. You and 1 deputy against 7 of us. You really want to die for some Chinese workers you don't even know? Rebecca's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to step forward, moving to stand beside Thomas. There are more than just Thomas and the deputy who care, she said, her voice shaking slightly but determined. I care, and I think if you asked the people in this crowd, you'd find a lot of them care too. A murmur ran through the assembled townsfolk. To Rebecca's surprise and relief, several men stepped forward from the crowd, standing shoulder to shoulder with Thomas and the deputy. Mr. Patterson, the general store owner Ruth worked for, was one of them. So was the local blacksmith and the owner of the hardware store. Seems like you're the one who's outnumbered now, Hayes, Thomas said quietly. Last chance. Put down your weapons and walk away. For a tense moment, Hayes looked like he might actually start shooting. But then he looked at the growing number of armed townsfolk facing him, and something in his expression shifted. With a snarl, he holstered his gun and gestured to his men. This isn't over, Kellen. You just made yourself some powerful enemies. I can live with that, Thomas replied. Hayes and his men pushed through the crowd and disappeared down the street. The moment they were gone, the tension broke, and everyone started talking at once. Thomas immediately turned to the Chinese workers, speaking to them in what Rebecca realized with surprise was passable Cantonese. She did not understand the words, but she could see the relief flooding the workers' faces as Thomas assured them they were safe. Mr. Green, the station master, shook Thomas's hand vigorously. Thank you, son. Those men have been causing trouble for weeks, but nobody would stand up to them. Someone should have, Thomas said grimly. Nobody deserves to be treated like property. Rebecca felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. This man, this good, brave, complicated man, had just risked his life for people he did not know, because it was the right thing to do. How could he possibly think he was broken or unworthy? As the crowd dispersed and the Chinese workers were escorted to safety by the deputy, Thomas turned to Rebecca. You shouldn't have stepped forward like that, he said, but there was no anger in his voice, only concern. You could have been hurt. So could you, Rebecca pointed out, but you did it anyway, because that's who you are, Thomas Kellen. You see injustice and you stand against it, no matter the cost. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, and Rebecca saw something shift in his expression. Walk with me? He asked quietly. They walked through the darkening streets of Cheyenne, past the saloons with their tinkling piano music, and the shops closing up for the night. When they reached the boarding house, Thomas stopped on the porch but made no move to leave. I need to tell you something, he said, his voice low and intense, and I need you to really hear me, Rebecca. She nodded, her heart racing. I'm falling in love with you, Thomas said simply. I've been fighting it for weeks because I know all the reasons it's a bad idea. I'm too old for you, too broken, too haunted by my past. But today, when I saw you standing beside me at that station, ready to face down armed men because you believed it was right, I realized something. I realized that maybe I don't have to be perfect to deserve happiness. Maybe I just have to be willing to keep trying, keep fighting for what's good. Tears were streaming down Rebecca's face, but they were tears of joy. I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered. I have been since that first day when you looked at us on that platform and said we were free. You gave me my life back, Thomas, and now I want to share that life with you. Thomas reached up and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks. Are you sure? He asked. Because once we start down this path, I'm not letting go. I lost a family once, and it nearly destroyed me. If I'd let myself love you, it will be forever. I need you to be certain. I'm certain, Rebecca said firmly. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Thomas pulled her close, and when his lips met hers, it was like coming home. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened into something passionate and full of promise. Rebecca wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding inside for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. I'll court you properly, he promised. I'll talk to your sisters, make sure they approve. I'll do this right, Rebecca. You deserve that. Rebecca smiled. I think Ruth already approves. She's been making comments about what a good man you are for the past 2 weeks. And Rose adores you. She told me yesterday that she wishes you could be her brother. Maybe I can be more than that, Thomas said softly. Maybe I can be family for real. They stood on the porch holding each other for a long time, neither wanting to break the spell. Finally, Thomas reluctantly pulled away. I should let you get inside. It's late, and you have work in the morning. Rebecca nodded, but before she went inside, she turned back. Thomas, thank you. For everything. He smiled, and it transformed his entire face, making him look younger and lighter. Thank you for giving me a reason to hope again. The courtship that followed was sweet and proper, and everything Rebecca had never known she wanted. Thomas took her on picnics by the creek, brought her wildflowers he picked on his rides through the prairie, and spent long evenings on Mrs. Henderson's porch talking with her and her sisters about everything and nothing. Ruth warmed to him quickly once she saw how happy he made Rebecca, and Rose treated him like the brother she had always wanted. In August, Thomas took Rebecca to a dance at the town hall. She wore a new dress she had sewn herself, pale blue cotton with white lace trim, and Thomas wore his Sunday best. He was not much of a dancer, he warned her, but he proved to be a quick learner, and they waltzed around the floor until Rebecca was breathless and laughing. During a break in the music, Thomas led her outside to the porch where they could talk without shouting over the noise. The night air was cool and pleasant after the heat of the crowded hall. Thomas took both her hands in his and looked at her with an expression so tender it made her heart ache. Rebecca, I know we haven't been courting that long, he began, and maybe this is too fast, but I'm not getting any younger, and I've wasted enough years of my life dwelling on the past. So, I'm just going to ask you straight out. He took a deep breath. Will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a broken-down cowboy with more regrets than money and let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy? Rebecca felt like her heart might burst right out of her chest. Yes, she said, the word coming out as half laugh, half sob. Yes, Thomas, I'll marry you, 1,000 times, yes. Thomas pulled her into his arms and kissed her soundly, and Rebecca kissed him back with all the love and joy surging through her. When they finally broke apart, both grinning like fools, Rebecca saw her sisters watching from the doorway with matching expressions of delight. Rose squealed and ran over to hug them both. I knew it! I told Ruth this was going to happen. Ruth followed more sedately, but she was smiling. Congratulations, she said warmly. I'm happy for you both, truly. They were married in September, a simple ceremony at the small church in Cheyenne, with half the town in attendance. Rebecca wore a dress of ivory silk that Miss Paulson had helped her sew, with a crown of wildflowers in her dark hair. Thomas wore a new suit he had purchased specially for the occasion, and when he saw Rebecca walking down the aisle toward him, his eyes grew suspiciously bright. The ceremony was short but meaningful. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Thomas kissed his bride tenderly, and the church erupted in applause and cheers. After the ceremony, there was a reception at the town hall with music and dancing and more food than Rebecca had ever seen in one place. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, Thomas pulled Rebecca aside. I have something for you, he said. A wedding present. He led her outside to where a wagon waited, and Rebecca's eyes widened when she saw what was loaded in the back. Lumber, lots of it, along with tools and supplies. "I bought us some land about 5 miles outside of town," Thomas explained. "Nothing fancy, just 20 acres with a good creek running through it. I thought we could build a house there, start a real home, if that's all right with you." Rebecca threw her arms around him. "It's more than all right. It's perfect." "There's enough land for your sisters, too," Thomas added. "If they want to build their own places nearby, I thought maybe we could all stay close. Be a real family." Rebecca kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. "Have I told you today that you're the most wonderful man in the world?" Thomas grinned. "You might have mentioned it once or twice." They spent their wedding night at a small hotel in town, and the next morning they began the work of building their new life together. Thomas was as good as his word, and over the next few months he worked tirelessly to construct a house on their land. It was not large or fancy, just 3 rooms and a loft, but it was solid and well built, with large windows that let in the Wyoming sunshine and a porch where they could sit and watch the prairie sunsets. Ruth and Rose helped with the building when they could, and gradually they too began making plans for their own futures in Cheyenne. Ruth had caught the attention of Mr. Patterson, the widower who owned the general store, and though she tried to hide it, Rebecca could see the flush that came to her sister's cheeks whenever he was near. Rose, still young and full of dreams, talked about maybe opening her own restaurant someday where she could cook and sing for guests. By the time winter arrived, Rebecca and Thomas were settled in their new home. It was a simple life, but it was good. Thomas continued working as a foreman for the cattle operation, and Rebecca kept sewing for Miss Paulson a few days a week, but mostly they focused on building their ranch. They had purchased a few head of cattle and some chickens, and Thomas talked about maybe getting some horses in the spring. One cold December evening, as they sat by the fireplace with Rebecca wrapped in a quilt and Thomas reading aloud from a book of poetry, Rebecca interrupted him with some news she had been holding close to her heart for a few weeks. "Thomas, I need to tell you something." He looked up from the book, immediately attentive. "What is it? Are you all right?" Rebecca smiled and took his hand, placing it on her still flat stomach. "I'm fine, more than fine. We're going to have a baby." Thomas's eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed frozen. Then, very carefully, he set the book aside and pulled Rebecca into his arms. She could feel him trembling. "A baby," he whispered. "Rebecca, are you sure?" "I'm sure," she confirmed. "I saw the doctor in town last week. He says the baby should come sometime in late May or early June." Thomas pulled back to look at her face, and Rebecca was shocked to see tears streaming down his cheeks. "I didn't think I'd ever get this chance again," he said, his voice breaking. "After I lost my first daughter, I thought that part of my life was over forever." Rebecca cupped his face in her hands. "You're going to be a wonderful father, Thomas. This baby is so lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one," Thomas said fiercely. "You and this baby, you're everything I never thought I deserved. I'm going to spend every day of my life making sure you both know how loved you are." The winter passed slowly, with Thomas fussing over Rebecca like she was made of spun glass. She found it both endearing and occasionally frustrating, especially when he tried to keep her from doing any kind of work at all. But she understood his fear. He had lost so much already. The thought of losing her, or the baby, terrified him. In February, Ruth announced her own engagement to Mr. Patterson, who asked her to call him William. The wedding was planned for April, and Rose threw herself into helping Ruth prepare, seemingly thrilled to have something exciting to focus on. Rebecca was happy for her sister, though she noticed that Rose seemed a bit wistful at times, as if watching her sisters find love made her aware of her own loneliness. Ruth's wedding was a joyful affair, though smaller than Rebecca and Thomas's had been. Afterward, Ruth moved into William's large house in town, but she visited the ranch often, always bringing news and gossip from Cheyenne. She seemed genuinely happy with William, who treated her with kindness and respect. As spring arrived and Rebecca's pregnancy became more visible, she found herself growing increasingly anxious about the birth. She tried to hide her fears from Thomas, but he knew her too well. One evening in early May, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie, Thomas took her hand. "Talk to me," he said gently. "I can see you're worried about something." Rebecca sighed. "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if something goes wrong?" What if I'm like your first wife and I get sick and die, leaving you alone again with a baby to care for? Thomas turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Rebecca, listen to me. I won't lie and say nothing can go wrong. Childbirth is dangerous, and I'm terrified too. But you're strong and healthy, and Doc Warner says everything looks good. And no matter what happens, we'll face it together. You're not alone in this. Do you understand? I'm right here with you, and I'm not going anywhere. Rebecca felt tears spilling down her cheeks, and Thomas gently wiped them away. I love you so much, she whispered. I can't imagine my life without you. You won't have to, Thomas promised. We're going to grow old together, you and me. We're going to raise this baby and watch them grow up. And we're going to build a life so full of love that all the pain of the past will fade into nothing but memory. As if in response to his words, Rebecca felt the baby move inside her, a strong kick that made her gasp and laugh at the same time. Thomas's hand was still on her belly, and his eyes widened. That was our baby, Rebecca confirmed, placing her hand over his. Saying hello, Thomas laughed, a sound of pure joy, and pulled Rebecca close. They sat together on the porch as the stars came out, feeling their baby move and dreaming of the future. Rebecca went into labor on a warm afternoon in late May, just as the wildflowers were blooming across the prairie. Thomas had been mending a fence when Rose came riding up on her horse, yelling that it was time. He had never moved so fast in his life, racing back to the house to find Rebecca pacing the bedroom, her face tight with pain. Doc Warner arrived within the hour, a calm, competent man in his 60s who had delivered half the babies in Cheyenne. Ruth and Rose were there too, ready to help however they could. Thomas wanted to stay with Rebecca, but Doc Warner initially shooed him out of the room, saying he would just be in the way. But Rebecca reached for him, her hand gripping his with surprising strength. Don't leave me, she pleaded. Please, Thomas, I need you here. Doc Warner looked surprised, but nodded. If that's what the lady wants, then you can stay. But you do what I tell you, and don't get in my way. Thomas stayed, holding Rebecca's hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement and love. Even when she squeezed his hand so hard, he thought his bones might break. The labor lasted through the night and into the next morning, long and difficult. And there were moments when Thomas felt his old fears rising up, threatening to drown him. But Rebecca was stronger than he had given her credit for. She fought through the pain with a determination that left him in awe. And when the sun rose on a new day and the baby finally came, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Thomas felt like his heart might explode from sheer joy and relief. It's a boy, Doc Warner announced, quickly checking the baby over, before wrapping him in a clean blanket and placing him in Rebecca's arms. A healthy baby boy. Congratulations. Rebecca looked down at their son, tears streaming down her exhausted face, and Thomas thought he had never seen anything more beautiful in his entire life. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that were still the murky blue of all newborns. He was tiny and perfect, and Thomas could not believe something so precious had come from him. Do you want to hold him? Rebecca asked softly. Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. Rebecca placed the baby carefully in his arms, and Thomas looked down at his son, this miracle he had never thought he would have again. Hello, little one, he whispered. Welcome to the world. The baby made a small noise and seemed to nestle closer against Thomas's chest. Ruth and Rose crowded close to get a better look at their nephew, both cooing and exclaiming over how beautiful he was. What are you going to name him? Rose asked. Thomas looked at Rebecca, and she smiled. They had discussed names but never quite settled on one. Now, looking at their son, Thomas knew exactly what felt right. James, he said. James Kellen, after Rebecca's father. Rebecca's eyes filled with fresh tears. That's perfect, she whispered. Doc Warner finished checking over Rebecca and pronounced her healthy and recovering well, though he insisted she needed to rest for at least a week. After he left, Ruth and Rose reluctantly departed as well, promising to come back the next day with food and supplies. Finally alone with his new family, Thomas carefully placed baby James in the cradle he had built, and then climbed into bed beside Rebecca, pulling her gently into his arms. She was exhausted but happy, her head resting on his shoulder. We did it, she murmured sleepily. We made a family, Thomas. You did all the hard work, Thomas replied, kissing the top of her head. You were so brave, Rebecca. I'm in awe of you. "I'm just glad it's over," she admitted with a tired laugh, "and glad he's here and healthy." They lay together in the quiet of the bedroom, watching their son sleep in his cradle. Thomas felt a peace settle over him that he had not experienced in years. All the guilt and pain of his past had not disappeared completely, but it had faded, transformed into something he could live with. He had not been able to save his first wife or raise his first daughter, and those would always be sorrows he carried, but he had been given a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it. As the days turned into weeks, Thomas discovered all over again what it meant to be a father. James was a good baby, sleeping well and eating heartily, and Thomas loved every moment of caring for him. He changed diapers and walked the floor during the occasional fussy night, and he sang lullabies in his rough, off-key voice that somehow always seemed to soothe his son. Rebecca recovered quickly from the birth, and by the time James was a month old, she was back to her normal activities, though Thomas still tried to keep her from overexerting herself. They settled into a rhythm as a family, learning to navigate the challenges and joys of new parenthood together. In July, when James was 6 weeks old, they took him into town for the first time, so he could be baptized at the church. Half of Cheyenne turned out to see the Kellen baby, and Thomas felt a surge of pride as he stood at the front of the church with his wife and son, surrounded by friends and family. After the baptism, there was a celebration at Ruth and William's house, with food and laughter and congratulations. Rose held baby James for most of the afternoon, bouncing him gently and singing to him in her sweet voice. Thomas noticed that a young man who worked at the bank kept finding excuses to talk to Rose, and she seemed to welcome his attention, blushing and smiling. As the sun began to set and guests started departing, Thomas found Rebecca sitting in Ruth's garden, nursing James in the shade of an apple tree. He sat down beside her, feeling content and peaceful. "This is a good life we've built," he said quietly. Rebecca looked up at him and smiled. "It's the best life," she agreed. "I never imagined I could be this happy, especially after everything that happened. But you gave me this, Thomas. You saved me in more ways than one." "You saved me too," Thomas replied. "I was just existing before I met you, going through the motions. But you made me remember how to really live, how to hope and dream and love again." They sat together as the evening shadows lengthened, their son content between them, and Thomas thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with an act of desperate compassion at an auction in Cheyenne, 3 sisters being sold like property and a cowboy with a guilty conscience who could not stand by and let it happen. But it had become so much more than that. It had become a love story, a second chance, a redemption. The years that followed were full and happy. James grew into an energetic toddler with his mother's quick mind and his father's stubborn determination. When he was 2 years old, Rebecca gave birth to a daughter they named Clara, who had her father's gray eyes and her mother's gentle spirit. 2 years after that, another son arrived, whom they called Daniel, completing their family. The ranch prospered under Thomas's careful management. They expanded their cattle herd and built a larger house to accommodate their growing family. Thomas proved to be everything Rebecca had known he would be as a father, patient and loving, and endlessly devoted to his children. Ruth and William had children of their own, 2 daughters who were close in age to James and Clara. Rose eventually married the banker who had courted her, a kind man named Samuel who appreciated her spirit and encouraged her dreams. She did open her own restaurant in Cheyenne, a cheerful place that became known for its excellent food and the owner's beautiful singing voice. The 3 sisters remained close, getting together often with their families. They never forgot where they had come from, the nightmare of that auction and the terror of thinking their lives were over before they had truly begun. But they also never let it define them. Instead, they built new lives full of love and purpose, supporting each other and raising their children to be kind and strong. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Rebecca back to the creek where he had first told her he was falling in love with her. It was a warm September evening, much like the one all those years ago. Their children were spending the night with Ruth and William, giving Thomas and Rebecca a rare evening alone. They walked hand in hand along the creek bank, talking and laughing, and Thomas marveled at how she was even more beautiful now than she had been as a young woman. Motherhood and the years had added maturity and depth to her features, but her eyes still sparkled with the same joy and determination that had first captivated him. When they reached their favorite spot, a bend in the creek where wildflowers grew thick and the water ran clear over smooth stones, Thomas pulled Rebecca into his arms. "Do you remember the first time I brought you here?" he asked. "Of course," Rebecca replied. "You told me I scared you because I made you want things you thought you had lost the right to want." Thomas smiled. "I was such a fool, thinking I didn't deserve happiness. Thank God you were stubborn enough to prove me wrong." "I saw the man you really were," Rebecca said, reaching up to cup his cheek. "I saw past the guilt and the pain to the good heart underneath. And I knew I wanted to spend my life with that man." "You've given me more than I ever dreamed possible," Thomas said seriously. "A wife I love more with each passing day. 3 beautiful children, a home, a family, a purpose. You've given me back my life, Rebecca." "We gave each other life," Rebecca corrected gently. "You saved me from that auction, but I saved you from drowning in your past. We're even, Thomas Kellen." He kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of 10 years of love and partnership. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Here's to another 10 years, Thomas said, "and another 10 after that, and another after that." "Here's to forever," Rebecca replied. They stood together by the creek as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Thomas sent up a silent prayer of thanks. He thought about the man he had been 10 years ago, broken and guilt-ridden, spending his money to free strangers from bondage in a desperate attempt to atone for his past failures. He had not known then that in saving those 3 sisters, he would also be saving himself. Life had taught Thomas that redemption was possible, that second chances were real, and that love had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. He had lost his first family through tragedy and circumstance, and that loss would always be a part of him. But he had been blessed with a second family, one he had chosen and built with his own 2 hands and a heart that refused to give up on the possibility of happiness. As they walked back toward their horse and the ride home to their children, Thomas squeezed Rebecca's hand. She squeezed back, and in that simple gesture was a lifetime of understanding and connection. They had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, but they had built something real and lasting and true. The house they returned to that night was full of the evidence of their life together. Children's toys scattered on the floor, Rebecca's sewing basket by her favorite chair, Thomas's boots by the door. It was not a perfect house or a perfect life, but it was theirs, built on a foundation of love and sacrifice and the courage to believe in second chances. As the years continued to pass, the Kellen family became a fixture in Cheyenne. Thomas was known as a fair and honest rancher, someone who could be counted on to help a neighbor in need. Rebecca's sewing work was sought after throughout the territory, and she took pride in teaching her daughter Clara the skills her own mother had taught her. James grew tall and strong, with his father's work ethic and his mother's compassion. He loved working on the ranch, and Thomas knew that one day the boy would take over and run it himself. Clara was gentle and artistic, always drawing or writing stories, her imagination as boundless as the Wyoming sky. Daniel, the youngest, was wild and fearless, always getting into trouble and making his parents laugh with his antics. The children grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, though Thomas and Rebecca were careful to tell it in a way that was appropriate for young ears. They wanted their children to understand the injustice that had almost destroyed their family before it began, but also to know the power of compassion and courage to change lives. When James was 16 and asked his father about that day at the auction, Thomas took him on a long ride through the prairie and told him the full story, holding nothing back. He told him about the slave train he had worked for in his youth, about the death of his first wife and the loss of his first daughter, about the years of guilt and self-recrimination. "I spent $3,000 that day," Thomas told his son as they sat on a ridge overlooking their land. "It was most of the money I had saved up over the years, and I would do it again in a heartbeat, because those 3 women deserved their freedom. But I never expected to get anything back from it. I certainly never expected to fall in love with one of them and build a life like this." James, who looked so much like Thomas had at that age, nodded thoughtfully. "You did the right thing, Pa. Even when it was hard and scary, you stood up for what was right." "I try," Thomas said. "I don't always succeed, and I've made more mistakes than I can count. But your mother taught me that trying is what matters. Showing up and doing the best you can, even when you're afraid. That's what makes a good man, son." "You're a good man, Pa," James said simply. "The best I know." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "That means more to me than you know, son." They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, and Thomas thought about the legacy he would leave his children. Not money or land, though they would inherit those things, but something more important. The example of a man who had made terrible mistakes and spent the rest of his life trying to make amends. A man who had learned that love and compassion were stronger than guilt and regret. A man who had been given a second chance and made the most of it. When Thomas was 52 and Rebecca was 40, they learned they were expecting another child. It was a surprise, as they had thought their family was complete, but it was a welcome one. Rebecca's pregnancy was more difficult than her previous ones, and Thomas worried constantly, but she remained strong and determined. In the spring of 1895, Rebecca gave birth to their fourth child, another daughter they named Grace. The birth was hard, and Doc Warner, now in his 80s and preparing to retire, warned them there should not be any more children. But Grace was healthy and perfect, and Thomas held his youngest daughter with the same wonder and gratitude he had felt holding James 17 years earlier. The older children doted on their baby sister, and Grace grew up surrounded by love and family. She was a happy child, always laughing, and she brought a special joy to the household in her later years. As Thomas moved into his 50s and then his 60s, he gradually turned more of the ranch operations over to James, who had grown into a capable and responsible young man. James married a sweet young woman named Elizabeth, and they had children of their own, giving Thomas and Rebecca grandchildren to spoil. Clara married a teacher from back east who had come to Cheyenne to work at the growing school system. They settled in town, and Clara continued her writing, eventually publishing a book of poetry that became quite popular in the territory. Daniel followed his own path, becoming a deputy sheriff and earning a reputation for fairness and integrity that would have made his father proud. Rose also remained close to the family. The youngest sister lived a long, happy life as well, eventually taking over Rebecca's sewing business when Rebecca retired. Grace, the unexpected blessing of Thomas and Rebecca's later years, grew into a beautiful and intelligent young woman who became a teacher like her brother-in-law. On the evening of their 25th wedding anniversary, Thomas and Rebecca sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant colors. They were older now, with gray in their hair and lines on their faces, but their love had only deepened with time. 25 years, Rebecca mused, her hand in Thomas's. It seems like yesterday, and like a lifetime ago, all at once. Best 25 years of my life, Thomas said. Though I have to admit, there were times in the beginning when I couldn't believe you actually wanted to marry me, Rebecca laughed. You were so convinced you didn't deserve to be happy. I had to work hard to change your mind. You succeeded, Thomas said, raising her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. You gave me back my life, Rebecca. You gave me everything. We gave each other everything, Rebecca replied, the same thing she always said when Thomas got too sentimental about her role in his redemption. We saved each other, Thomas. That's what love does. They sat together as the stars came out, their family scattered around them, James and Elizabeth, in the small house they had built on the property, Daniel visiting from town, Clara and her family in the guest room. Grace was inside practicing her piano, the notes drifting out through the open windows. Thomas thought about the long journey that had brought him to this moment. He thought about the scared, guilty man he had been at 29, spending his savings to free 3 sisters from an auction because he could not bear to let another injustice pass. He thought about the risk Rebecca had taken, trusting a stranger who claimed to want nothing from her, opening her heart to a broken man who did not believe he deserved love. He thought about all the moments that had brought them here, the first kiss by the creek, the wedding in the little church, the birth of each of their children, the laughter and tears and ordinary days that had woven together into an extraordinary life. Do you have any regrets? Rebecca asked quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Thomas considered the question carefully. I regret the mistakes I made in my youth, he said honestly. I regret the pain I caused my first wife by leaving her when she needed me. I regret that I never got to watch my first daughter grow up. Those regrets will always be with me. He paused, squeezing Rebecca's hand. But I don't regret anything that happened after the day I saw you and your sisters on that auction platform. Every choice I made from that moment on led me to this, to you, to our family, and I wouldn't change any of it. Rebecca leaned her head on his shoulder. I don't have any regrets either, she said. Even the terrible things that happened, the attack on our wagon, my parents' deaths, the auction, all of it brought me to you. And I would go through it all again if I knew you would be waiting on the other side." They sat together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that had healed them both. Their story had started with an act of compassion, with one man's desperate need to do something right after so many wrongs. But it had become a testament to the power of love to transform lives, to the possibility of second chances, and to the truth that sometimes the people we save end up saving us right back. Inside the house, Grace finished her piano practice and began playing a song Thomas recognized, a simple melody Rebecca had taught all the children, something her mother had sung to her when she was young. The music drifted out into the night, sweet and pure, and Thomas felt a deep contentment settle over him. He had been given more than he deserved, more than he had dared to hope for. A wife who loved him, children who respected him, grandchildren who would carry on the family name. A ranch that prospered, a place in the community, and most importantly, peace with his past. The scars were still there, the memories of loss and failure that had shaped him, but they no longer defined him. Instead, they had become part of the foundation upon which he had built something good and lasting. As the years continued to pass and Thomas entered his 70s, he slowed down considerably. His body, weathered by decades of hard ranch work, ached in the mornings, and he could no longer ride as long or work as hard as he once had. But he remained active and engaged, spending his days helping James manage the ranch and his evenings on the porch with Rebecca, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Rebecca aged gracefully beside him, her dark hair now silver, her face lined but still beautiful to Thomas. They celebrated their 30th anniversary, then their 35th, each year a gift they never took for granted. In the summer of 1913, when Thomas was 77 and Rebecca was 65, they gathered their entire family for a reunion at the ranch. All their children were there with their spouses and children. Ruth and William came from town, both elderly now, but still sharp and engaged. Rose arrived with Samuel, her restaurant having been passed to their eldest son. The house and yard were full of people, 3 generations of the family that had started with a cowboy's act of compassion and a young woman's willingness to trust. There were over 20 people present, a sprawling, noisy, wonderful gathering that filled Thomas's heart to bursting. As the sun set on the summer evening, Thomas stood and called for everyone's attention. The crowd quieted, all eyes turning to him. He looked around at all the faces, seeing pieces of himself and Rebecca in their children and grandchildren, seeing the legacy they had created together. "I'm an old man now," Thomas began, his voice still strong despite his years. "And I've lived a long life, longer than I probably deserved. I've made mistakes, more than I can count, and I've been blessed beyond measure. But the greatest blessing of my life happened 30 years ago, when I walked into an auction in Cheyenne and saw 3 young women who needed help." He looked at Rebecca, Ruth, and Rose, the 3 sisters who had changed everything. "I thought I was saving you that day," he continued, "but the truth is, you saved me. Rebecca, you gave me back my life. You taught me that I didn't have to be perfect to deserve love, that second chances were real, and you, Ruth and Rose, you welcomed me into your family and trusted me when you had every reason not to." Rebecca was crying now, and so were her sisters. Many of the grandchildren looked confused, not knowing the full story of how their family began. "So, I wanted to say thank you," Thomas said, his own voice thick with emotion. "To my wife, my sisters-in-law, and to all of you who are here because 3 young women were brave enough to trust a broken cowboy who just wanted to do something right. This family, this life we've built together, it's everything I never knew I needed, and I'm grateful for every single day." The gathering erupted in applause, and Thomas sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. Rebecca was immediately at his side, taking his hand and kissing his weathered cheek. "That was beautiful," she whispered. "It was the truth," Thomas replied simply. As the party continued around them and the summer night deepened, Thomas and Rebecca slipped away to their bedroom. Thomas was tired in a way that had become familiar lately, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of a life fully lived. "I'm ready, you know," he said quietly as Rebecca helped him prepare for bed. "When the time comes, I'm ready. I've had more than I ever thought possible. I'm at peace." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "Don't talk like that. We still have time." "Sometime," Thomas agreed. "But not forever. Nobody gets forever. And I want you to know that when I go, I'll go happy. Because of you. Because of the life we built together. I love you, Rebecca said fiercely. I have from the moment you stood on that platform and told us we were free, and I'll love you until the day I die and beyond. Thomas pulled her close, and they lay together in the bed they had shared for 3 decades, holding each other as they had through countless nights. Outside, they could hear their family laughing and talking, the sound of life and love continuing. Thomas Kellen passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 months later, on a clear September morning, with Rebecca holding his hand. He was 77 years old, and he died as he had lived the second half of his life surrounded by love, at peace with his past, and grateful for the second chance he had been given. His funeral was attended by half of Cheyenne and all of the family he had helped create. Rebecca stood strong through the service, supported by her sisters and children, and when they lowered Thomas into the ground on a hill overlooking the ranch, she placed a single wildflower on his coffin, the same kind of wildflowers he had picked for her during their courtship. Rebecca lived another 12 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She continued to sow and tell stories about Thomas, making sure the younger generations understood the kind of man he had been. She spoke often about that day at the auction, about the cowboy who had spent a fortune to set 3 sisters free and ended up finding his own freedom in the process. When Rebecca died peacefully at the age of 77, she was buried beside Thomas on the hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Their headstones were simple, bearing their names and the dates of their lives, but to their family, they represented so much more. They represented hope and second chances, love and redemption, and the truth that sometimes the greatest stories start with a simple act of compassion. The ranch remained in the family for generations, passed down from James to his children, and then to theirs. The story of Thomas and Rebecca became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. 3 sisters sold at an auction, a cowboy who bought them all and set them free, and a love story that proved second chances were real and that broken people could find healing in each other's arms. In the end, Thomas Kellen's legacy was not measured in acres or cattle or money, though he had accumulated some of each. It was measured in the family he had created, in the lives he had touched, and in the example he had set of what it meant to be a truly good man. He had made mistakes, terrible ones, but he had spent the rest of his life trying to make amends. And in doing so, he had found not just redemption, but love, purpose, and a peace that surpassed all understanding. The 3 sisters he had freed that day in Cheyenne had all lived long, happy lives, surrounded by the families they had created. They had taken the freedom Thomas gave them and used it to build something beautiful. And in doing so, they had given him the greatest gift of all, the chance to be part of a family again, to love and be loved, and to know that his life had mattered. Years after both Thomas and Rebecca had passed, their great-granddaughter found a box in the attic of the ranch house. Inside were letters, dozens of them, that Thomas and Rebecca had written to each other over the years. There were also newspaper clippings about the auction in 1883, and a worn piece of paper with Thomas's handwriting that said simply, June 15th, 1883, the day my life began again. The great-granddaughter shared these treasures with the family, and they all gathered at the ranch to read through them, marveling at the love story that had started their family line. They stood on the porch where Thomas and Rebecca had spent so many evenings together, looking out at the same Wyoming sky, and felt the weight of the legacy they had inherited. They were the descendants of a man who had made terrible mistakes but found the courage to change, and a woman who had been brave enough to love him despite his broken past. They carried in their blood the determination of 3 sisters who had refused to let tragedy define them, who had taken the freedom they were given and built extraordinary lives. And they understood, perhaps more clearly than any history book could teach, that ordinary people could do extraordinary things, that compassion could change the world, that second chances were real and precious and worth fighting for, that love, real and lasting love, had the power to heal even the deepest wounds and create beauty from ashes. The Kellen family legacy lived on, generation after generation, a testament to one cowboy's decision to stand up against injustice and 3 sisters' willingness to trust a stranger. It was a story of the Wild West, yes, but more importantly, it was a story of hope, redemption, and the enduring power of love to transform lives. And it all started on a dusty platform in Cheyenne, Wyoming, in June of 1883, when a cowboy looked at three terrified young women and spoke four words that changed everything. "You're free now,